The state of Minnesota hasn't voted for a Republican nominee for president since Richard Nixon in 1972. And yet currently Donald Trump is polling within the margin of error, trailing President Biden by just over 2 percentage points. So in today's video, we're going to talk about how realistic a red Minnesota in 2024 could be and whether or not this is the most likely outcome in the election, and also what it would take to flip Minnesota for Donald Trump if he was to have sort of a perfect storm in November. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So we're also going to bring up some other data in Minnesota. We're going to talk about primary data as well, because I think it's sort of important and it's going to factor into something that we're going to talk about a bit later. But first, we'll start off, obviously, with the state of Minnesota itself. In the last two presidential elections, Minnesota obviously went to the Democrat. Hillary Clinton won the state of Minnesota very narrowly back in 2016. And this was really the election. I think that Minnesota was finally in reach. I mean, back in 2012, Obama won the state comfortably by nearly 8 percentage points. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton nearly lost the state to Donald Trump. And I describe it as Hillary Clinton nearly losing the state because Hillary Clinton only got 46% of the vote. Donald Trump got about 45% of the vote. That's about the same percentage of the vote that Mitt Romney got back in 2012. So Donald Trump really didn't do any better than Mitt Romney. In fact, I think he did slightly worse. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, did way worse than Barack Obama. Barack Obama got 52% of the vote in Minnesota back in 2012. Hillary Clinton's margin of victory was significantly less. And this was basically because the rural areas of the state had gone heavily in Donald Trump's direction, particularly the Iron Range in the northeastern part of the state, which Donald Trump chipped away pretty massively at Democratic margins here, and all throughout rural Minnesota in general. These counties were a much lighter shade of red, and in some cases, a lot of these counties were even blue for Obama back in 2012. And yet Donald Trump saw double-digit swings in the Republican direction in a lot of these areas. Now, the reason Minnesota didn't flip for Donald Trump in 2016 was because of the fact that the Minneapolis metro area had actually trended left. Places like Hennepin County, for example, Ramsey County, had actually gone away from Donald Trump, even while the rest of the state had been trending in his direction, in some cases by high double digits. But the Minneapolis area was the exception to this rule, and had this not happened, Donald Trump likely would have won the state of Minnesota incredibly narrowly. But fast forward to 2020, you have COVID, you have the BLM riots, and, Donald Trump actually puts effort into winning the state of Minnesota. Back in 2016, Donald Trump did one very last-minute rally in the state of Minnesota as the polls sort of tightened there. And I guess internal data was showing that he was very competitive here. And ultimately, it was all for nothing. Donald Trump lost the state by around 7 points. Basically the same margin Mitt Romney back in 2012 had lost the state. The only difference was the votes had sort of shifted around. Donald Trump did a lot better in the rural parts of the state than Mitt Romney, while Joe Biden did a lot better in the suburban parts of Minneapolis, for example, than Barack Obama did back in 2012. But ultimately, you get basically the same end result. Now, Minnesota hasn't been any more promising for Republicans since then. In 2018, the two major races, governor and Senate, easily went to the Democrats. Obviously, of course, the down-ballot Senate race against Tina Smith, who was sort of appointed to this seat after Al Franken had resigned. She ended up winning by over 5 percentage points. So while this was closer than the presidential election result, it really wasn't realistic that Republicans were going to be able to pick up this Senate seat. And of course, fast forward to 2022, and Democrats continue to win all statewide races in Minnesota. So the state continues to be blue, albeit in certain circumstances, a much lighter shade of it. Now, if we go to 2024 and we take a look at the polls overall in Minnesota, besides the Republican internal poll, which I certainly think is an outlier, Donald Trump has been closing the gap against Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden's always been in the lead in these polls, but the latest poll, the latest two rather, that aren't Republican internals, have Joe Biden up by just 2 points. Again, that's within the margin of error, and according to these polls, it could be anywhere from 4 to 5 points. So Donald Trump is certainly closing the gap, and I think the reason for that is the lack of enthusiasm in the state for Joe Biden and sort of a rebellion among the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And there's no better way to illustrate this than the primary results that we saw. And we'll talk about the Republican primary in just a second because I think that's also significant. But if we look at the Democratic primary, Joe Biden is the incumbent Democratic president. And yet within the Democratic primary, Joe Biden only gets 70% of the vote. The uncommitted movement, which has sort of been this pro-Palestine, anti-Joe Biden movement, garnered nearly 20% of the vote and got 11 delegates out of Minnesota. And that was mainly fueled by Muslim voters and progressive voters in the Minneapolis area. But you also saw some in Rice County, which I suspect, according to these results, probably has a significant Muslim population. But you've seen a backlash against the Democratic Party from Muslim voters and just progressives at large. And that's really illustrated in the primary results. And this is a big weakness of Joe Biden, because essentially he could end up in a similar situation to Hillary Clinton back in 2016, where he gets less than 50% of the vote and he gets dragged down incredibly close to where Donald Trump's percentage of the vote is at. So that's a pretty precarious position for the Democratic nominee. Obviously, as I said, Minnesota is an incredibly Democratic state. It currently has the longest streak of voting Democratic presidentially. And in 2024, while Joe Biden certainly still has the advantage in the state, and I think trends in the Minneapolis area might end up saving the Democrats, I think you're probably going to see rural Minnesota continue to trend more in the Republican direction, especially up here in sort of the Iron Range. Because, you know, had COVID not happened, had you not had the BLM riots, and these things that sort of dragged down Donald Trump's approval rating, he could have potentially done better in this northeastern part of the state, and probably did better in the suburban part of the state as well. Because if Donald Trump wants to win the state of Minnesota, he needs to do significantly better in suburban Minneapolis than he did in 2020, and sort of get the rural margins up higher than he did if he wants any chance at making the state close. Now, the saving grace for him is that with this uncommitted movement and this progressive backlash, you're probably going to see a decent chunk of voters in places like Hennepin County, Ramsey County, Dakota County, in and around Minneapolis, and potentially in other parts of the state as well, vote third party or just not show up to the polls or leave the presidential ballot blank, because they're still mad about what's going on in Israel or even the economy or many of the other gripes that progressives have against Joe Biden. And I think if you still have a hot war situation in the Middle East, that could potentially be disastrous for Biden, especially if he doesn't tailor his position to try and please the progressive portion of the base. Because, you know, he's really in a very unenviable position at the moment, because if he moves more in the pro-Palestine direction, he's obviously going to alienate Jewish voters in Minneapolis and around the state. But if he continues to double down on Israel, he alienates progressive voters, Muslim voters in the state. So, you know, and there's a significant Somali Muslim population in and around Minneapolis that, you know, if the election comes down to a few thousand votes, you know, if either candidate's getting, let's say, like 46% of the vote, that could make the difference. So the Democrats really can't afford to lose critical suburban support. So it's probably in Joe Biden's best interest to get something sorted out in the Middle East before November. But as for Donald Trump, he does have a major weakness, and that, of course, is the fact that he is bleeding with suburban voters and still hasn't been able to get a significant portion of suburban voters to come home to him, even voters within his own party. Nikki Haley got nearly 30% of the vote out of Minnesota and 12 delegates. And if we look at Hennepin County, for example, she gets 45% of the vote, Ramsey County 44%. So she's getting within 10 points of Donald Trump. So that tells us that there's a significant protest vote within the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party. These are probably old guard Republicans, Republicans in and around suburban Minneapolis. Maybe they haven't voted Republican the past couple of cycles, and they're really just voicing their discontent with Donald Trump by voting for Nikki Haley. Some of these voters, I suspect a decent amount, will probably vote for Joe Biden in 2024. But Donald Trump needs all the support he can get, both in the suburbs and around the state, if he wants to actually flip Minnesota. Because if we take a look at the Electoral College map, flipping Minnesota could prove a buffer in case Donald Trump fails to win, say, Wisconsin, for example. Let's say Donald Trump wins Nevada, Arizona. That would put him at 268. He needs one of these four states in order to win. And if he somehow pulls off a narrow upset in Minnesota, let's say because the third party factor, Joe Biden's at 46% of the vote, Donald Trump gets just slightly over that, and he narrowly loses Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, he would win the election. Now, granted, this is an incredibly unlikely scenario. I want to stress that because Minnesota votes to the left of all of the states. I just put blue, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So I certainly don't think this situation is likely by any metric, but in the rare instance where trends in these states go against Donald Trump and you do see a significant third-party vote in Minnesota, that could potentially be the perfect storm that Donald Trump needs. Now, the chance I put that at is definitely below, let's say 5%. I think it's very unlikely that Donald Trump wins Minnesota. I think Minnesota at this point is definitely going to be closer than it was in 2020, especially because I think these rural parts of the state are going to be a darker shade of red. And you could potentially even see slight inroads in the Minneapolis suburbs. Oh, I'm quite doubtful of that. I think Donald Trump probably improves in rural Minnesota. You could see a drop in turnout in the suburban parts, which would probably put the state at around D+5. But, you know, at this point in time, it's certainly not impossible for Donald Trump to carry the state at the end of the day. He'd obviously need to invest significant resources. And the fact that Joe Biden and the Democrats are taking Donald Trump's threat seriously of going around and campaigning in the state proves that, you know, they're not really in the most comfortable position to win re-election, needless to say. Joe Biden is underwater 17 points nationwide. In the state of Minnesota, he's underwater. So, you know, this is basically a disaster for Democrats. Even if Joe Biden does win the state of Minnesota by a couple of points, if that is the case, he probably loses the election because he most likely loses Pennsylvania, he loses Wisconsin, and potentially loses Michigan, which would give Donald Trump the election, barring the fact that he loses some states in the Sun Belt. But, you know, as of right now, I put the chance of red Minnesota at certainly less than 5%. It's not impossible. You need a significant drop in turnout in the Minneapolis area, and you would need an increase in turnout in rural Minnesota, and you need a significant shift to the right in places like St. Louis County, Blue Earth County, these more rural counties that are stubbornly still voting Democrat, even in the 2020s, bucking the trends of most other counties. Now, you know, northeastern Minnesota has sort of the union factor, but, you know, time and time again, we've seen election after election, Donald Trump's been able to make inroads with white working class union voters, and that could be his key to victory if you have significant decreases in turnout among minorities and progressives in the urban core around Minneapolis. But that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.